Well, the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, has called the country's biggest opposition party disingenuous. Now, that's after the Democratic Alliance wrote to Washington asking the US government to oversee the South African general election in May this year.
We say, do come and monitor. But now, for a non-state entity to do something like that, it's basically saying we are mortgaging our democracy to other parts. It doesn't matter to me who those are. We deal with regional organizations, continental organizations, and global organizations, and we invite them. So we think it's quite disingenuous, and there seems to be another agenda that underpins that.
Let's cross live now to historian and author Gerald Horne. Gerald, thanks so much for joining us. Now, on the face of it, this letter, I guess, would seem fairly reasonable. I mean, what's wrong with asking to ensure the integrity of upcoming elections and maybe a PVT count?
Well, you have to understand the context being that relations between Washington and Pretoria are headed to the basement. This has a lot to do with South Africa's relationship with the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which Washington fears is challenging credibly the hegemony of the so-called Group of Seven led by Washington, the Western Europeans, and Japan. Washington is also upset because South Africa dragged the U.S. ally Israel into the International Court of Justice on a charge of committing genocide in Gaza. Washington is concerned that it will be joined in this lawsuit as an aider and abettor. Similarly, in Washington, the U.S. Congress is threatening certain trade privileges and exemptions that South Africa enjoys under the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which is incensing Pretoria. And then you have to look at the wider regional context. That is to say, because of this downturn in Washington-Pretoria relations, there might be a silver lining in the cloud because Washington is now trying to improve relations with South Africa's neighbors, unavoidably to gain leverage against South Africa. I'm speaking to the trip to Angola a few months ago by U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Recall that in the 1970s, the United States collaborated with apartheid South Africa to block Angolan independence, and it took the dispatching of Cuban troops to that country to repel that apartheid invasion. Just a few days ago, Washington moved to lessen sanctions against Zimbabwe, the immediate northern neighbor of South Africa. That is to say, it tightened sanctions on the leaders and reduced them on the nation itself, and which was a real turnabout, and also points to this changing diplomatic relation between Pretoria and Washington.
Speaking more domestically about the situation in South Africa at the moment, in this letter, Gerald, the DA seems somewhat concerned about the ruling ANC party, and particularly the former President Jacob Zuma's MK party. It seems to believe that they're a threat to peace and stability within South Africa. Would you say that's the case?
No, that's laughable. It's well known that South Africa has one of the sturdiest and most stable democracies on the African continent. It's also well known that the so-called Democratic Alliance is a neo-apartheid policy, which is in bed with Washington. I'm sure that President Ramaphosa sees it as basically a cat's paw of U.S. imperialism, and I think that would help to generate his incensed reaction to this letter.
Well, sticking on that theme and the letter, it also claims that the ANC is trying to forge alliances with malign international actors and tyrannical regimes. What's your take on that as well, Gerald?
Well, that's a thinly veiled reference to my initial point. That is to say, Washington is upset with South Africa's close relations with Russia and with China in particular. It also has positive relations with Iran as well. All three of those nations are in the bad books of Washington, and Washington would like Pretoria to emulate it, which of course is not going to happen.
And finally, Gerald, this is obviously the second appeal. There was another letter signed by a number of parties back in February. I can assume that maybe they didn't get a response, hence they've sent this one to the State Department. How do you think Western governments will respond to this, if indeed they do?
Well, I assume that the United States in particular will seek its further enhanced collaboration with the Democratic Alliance. Recall that there was a controversy just a few months ago when a U.S. envoy in Pretoria charged that South Africa was supplying Russia militarily with regard to the conflict in Ukraine. Washington had to back down from that allegation, but once again, it's a signal. It's an indication of the downturn in relations between South Africa and the United States of America.
Well, Gerald, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Historian and author Gerald Horne, thanks very much for your take on this letter by the DA in South Africa. I'm sure we'll be having you on the programme a lot more in the run-up to those elections in South Africa.